Immediately asserting central control, this thrust opens diagonals and prepares for rapid piece development, dictating the initial tempo. Asserting central space is immediately contested, setting up a dynamic imbalance. Shielding the king's pawn with the knight immediately, but it neglects king's safety somewhat by blocking the bishop's diagonal. Developing the knight to an active square where it eyes the center and prepares for further central pawn advances is a standard and sound response. Immediately challenging the center, this thrust aims to rip open the pawn structure and gain space for white's pieces. Breaking the center pawn chain opens up diagonals and potential piece activity for both sides. Reclaiming the central pawn allows for active piece play, opening lines for quick development and potential kingside pressure. Grabbing central space with e5 immediately contests the knight and creates dynamic imbalances. Confronting the knight's advanced outpost forces black into a defensive posture, potentially sacrificing tempo for piece safety. Solidifying the pawn chain while simultaneously challenging the knight's forward position, a sound defensive posture. Solidifying central control while simultaneously preparing for a kingside pawn storm is a bold positional statement. This developing maneuver neatly shores up the center and prepares for kingside castling while contesting the d4 square. Reinforcing the knight's central presence solidifies white's positional grip while preparing further pawn advances. Disrupting white's knight outpost, a6 seeks to gain queenside space and potentially challenge the central pawn structure. That knight's repositioning awkwardly surrenders central influence for a flank attack that may prove too slow. Solidifying the bishop's role on the queenside, this maneuver prepares for eventual kingside play and strengthens the central pawn structure against white's knights. Shifting the knight allows for control of central squares and prepares for pawn advances later. Unleashing the bishop towards the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's central control and eye potential attacks. Developing the bishop to an active square frees the knight and prepares for kingside castling, building a solid central presence. Trading your bishop for white's knight opens the c-file for their rook and weakens your kingside diagonal. Opening the c-file with the rook asserts control over that crucial corridor. Developing the knight to control more central squares solidifies the pawn chain and prepares for further pawn advances. Securing the king amidst the developing storm unleashes white's hidden forces for an offensive surge. Seeking activity, black aims to reposition the knight towards the kingside, potentially unblocking the f-pawn and enhancing attacking prospects. Focusing the queen centrally prepares a potential kingside assault and supports the knight's coordinated advance. Bringing the king to safety, black shores up a vital defensive measure before white's queenside pressure escalates. Centralizing the rook on the d-file intensifies pressure, preparing for future pawn pushes or piece activity. Black boldly challenges white's central structure, aiming to disrupt coordination and potentially exploit weaknesses. Initiating a strategic retreat, the bishop repositions to a more passive defensive square, prioritizing king safety over central influence. Exposing the king's flank opens new avenues for attack. Be mindful of the resulting counterplay possibilities. A potential attempt to dislodge the knight, but it might weaken the kingside considerably. Securing the d-file for potential central breaks and preparing to reinforce the kingside defensive structure. Challenging the advanced knight, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure and potentially open lines for an attack. Forcing the knight away from its central outpost, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's coordination and create attacking chances. Sacrificing the bishop opens lines and forces a decision on the exposed king. Trading queens simplifies the position, potentially leading to an active endgame for black's pieces. Recapturing the rook clears the d-file and aims to consolidate your material advantage. Exchanging your bishop for their knight opens the h-file, creating dynamic attacking chances against the king. Activating the knight to c2 frees the d-file for rook pressure and prepares for central pawn expansion. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure prevents immediate threats and prepares to challenge the open d-file. Reinforcing the d-file's dominion and preparing to contest central control is the immediate objective. Exploding the center with f5 dramatically alters the pawn structure, injecting immediate tension and opening lines for black's pieces. Opening the e-file creates immediate complications and a target. Opening the g-file invites dynamic piece activity and creates immediate attacking possibilities on the queen side. Opening the d-file decisively to pressure black's position. Unleashing the pawn storm, black gambits material to rip open the king's defenses. Clearing the decisive file opens lines for your rooks. The knight's recapture on d8 opens the d-file for the black rook, aiming to contest crucial central territory. Reclaiming the d5 outpost seizes central control and pressures black's isolated pawns. Unlocking the d-file for the rook and challenging central control is a dynamic way to react to the isolated knight. Opening the g-file forcefully rips open the position for your remaining pieces. Recapturing the pawn opens the f-file, a potential pathway for increased piece activity. Reinforcing the pawn chain unlocks crucial central space, though it might offer black's rook a temporary pathway. Reactivating the king offers some much-needed central influence and potential support for the queenside pawns. Securing the king's safety, a paramount concern now that the pawn structure is fractured, allows white to breathe and reassess the fractured board. Activating the rook on the opened file provides crucial attacking impetus towards white's king. Reclaiming the central file, this knight reasserts positional influence, preparing for a potential breakthrough. Opening the c-file offers the rook excellent activity and potential penetration into white's territory. Pressing the central pawn structure, this knight repositions for potential pressure on the weakened kingside. Shifting the bishop to the flank opens lines for your rook and puts pressure on white's queenside pawns. A desperate gambit to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines, though it exposes white's king. The monarch retreats, consolidating defense around the now somewhat exposed king amidst the active enemy pieces. Expanding on the queenside secures space and prepares for potential pawn advances. Opening the d-file with the rook could lead to dynamic exchanges, but watch for tactical threats against your king. Reclaiming the open file for rook pressure provides crucial counterplay against black's passive setup. Seeking to activate the knight and challenge white's central pressure. Centralizing the king to support the pawns and prepare for potential pawn advances creates a more active defensive posture. A timely centralization of the rook, aiming to contest the d-file and pressure white's king. Sacrificing the knight clears the d-file, potentially opening lines for the rook and initiating a more active endgame for white. Exchanging rooks now simplifies the position, opening lines towards white's vulnerable king. Prioritizing king safety, white reroutes the monarch to a more protected square, setting the stage for potential pawn structure adjustments. Breaking open the queenside offers queenside counterplay and tries to destabilize white's pawn structure. Pushing the pawn advances the queenside majority, aiming to create a passed pawn while challenging black's cramped position. Suddenly opening up the e-file with the rook allows for active piece play, potentially targeting the white king's safety on the kingside. Reclaiming central influence with this knight redirects pressure, aiming to dismantle black's pawn structure and solidify white's advantage. Reclaiming the open d-file aims to disrupt white's rooks and potentially exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure. The monarch attempts to regroup, seeking safety amidst the developing chaos of the queen's rook endgame. Challenging the rook's position creates immediate pressure and aims to disrupt white's consolidated structure. Pushes the pawn to unlock the c-file, creating significant queenside play. Unleashing the bishop to threaten the doubled pawns creates immediate tactical discomfort and disrupts white's pawn chain. The knight's maneuver to b6 aggressively contests the open file, potentially trapping the rook. Centering the king offers better protection while preparing to contest the open files. Forcing the black king out of its defensive pawn shield creates a crucial dynamic. Trading the bishop here simplifies the position, potentially leading to a slightly better endgame for white due to his pawn structure. Pivoting the rook to the 7th rank leverages the open file for a potent blockade and potential pawn storm. Seizing the initiative with a checking pawn, black aims to disrupt white's rook coordination before the final consolidation. Securing the king in this open position is paramount before considering further pawn advances. Securing the rook on an open file to target the b-pawn presents a clear endgame objective. Unleashing the passed pawn's momentum, this advance aims to sever black's rook and create new possibilities. Pushing the pawn forward immediately creates a new pawn island, complicating white's endgame potential. The rook now asserts dominance on the open king's flank, creating immediate threats against black's exposed monarch. Shifting the king to the edge offers a desperate attempt to support the pawn advance, but it leaves it exposed to the open file. Pouncing on the exposed king, white opens lines for a decisive assault. Seeking active squares, the king ventures forward to support the pawn's final push. The king's exposed position on the king side demands immediate attention, as the rook swings over to deliver a potentially decisive check. The black king, now exposed to the white rook's pressure on the h-file, seeks refuge behind its remaining pawns. The monarch seeks refuge on the queen side, a calculated gambit to evade immediate threats and consolidate. Actively seeking to exploit the open queenside files, black aims to activate their rook and penetrate white's defenses. The monarch is cornered. This check forces a grim decision, potentially exposing the king further. King's exposed position invites further complications. Seek active counterplay before the pawn structure crumbles. Securing the king's escape route on the 1st rank now becomes a priority as the pawns advance. The king's safety is paramount. This pawn thrust into enemy territory leaves it exposed to immediate threats. Initiating a decisive mating attack by forcing the enemy king onto the decisive diagonal. Seeking the safety of the king amidst the advancing pawns, a pragmatic maneuver. Pushing the rook forward into the open file seals the king's fate. Introducing the rook to the 7th rank offers a glimmer of counterplay, though it feels a bit like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The white king ventures out, aiming to obstruct the black pawn's promotion path. Finally, the black king ventures out from its defensive shell, seeking active participation in the unfolding endgame drama. Clearing a path for your queen to menace the pawn structure, potentially forcing concessions. Securing the king and preparing to launch a queenside pawn storm offers a fighting chance in this complex position. Finally claiming the isolated b-pawn, white aims to simplify into a winning king and pawn endgame with this pawn grab. The rook's repositioning to the 7th rank now threatens to sever white's king from its defenders, creating immediate endgame concerns. Seizing the exposed pawn offers a clear material advantage, aiming to simplify into a winning endgame. Capturing the passed pawn is the logical final step in consolidating material advantage. Unlocking the rook's power along the now open file to harass the enemy king offers a clear path to victory. A final endgame dance begins, aiming to exploit the pawn structure for queenside advantage. Prioritizing king's safety now allows for a more active rook. Securing that passed pawn advances black's endgame advantage, a crucial step in outmaneuvering white's rook.